everybody. Welcome today to our presentation about the State Department. This is a collaboration between the Office of Career Planning and Law Career Services. So we're glad to see so many of you here today on a rainy Friday. I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers who are here to join us and tell us more about opportunities with the State Department, both the civil service side and the foreign service side. So I'll introduce our speakers and then let them share all their great information with you. So first we have Ambassador Louis Lukens. He is the State Department's diplomat in residence for the Northwest region based at UC Berkeley. Prior to his job, he was U.S. Ambassador to Senegal and Guinea-Bissau from 2011 to 2014. He's held many high-level jobs with the State Department, including as Executive Director of the State Department's Executive Secretariat, Consul General in Vancouver, Management Counselor in Dublin, and Executive Secretary in Baghdad. He served as Senior Director for Administration at the National Security Council from 2001 to 2002. He has a master's degree from Princeton University. And we also are pleased to have Michelle Arias joining us. She is the I'll be part of it, and then you'll be filling in some of the gaps for us. So Ms. Arias is the Deputy Director for the Office of Recruitment, Examination, and Employment, and where she works on the formulation and implementation of plans and policies necessary to carry out the department's foreign service recruitment mission. She joined the Department of State in 2008. Maybe I'll leave that there. And prior to that has had a significant career in public service. She was worked with the Army in civilian capacity. She served in a variety of roles with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I'm sure she will share a bit more about her journey as well as talk to you about opportunities at the State Department. So we're so thrilled that you're here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks you all for coming out on a wet Friday. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. This is a school that has a lot of very distinguished and prominent alumni. So it's a great honor, and this is sort of, I think, fertile recruiting ground for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the State Department, the Foreign Service side of the State Department, and Michelle's going to talk about the Civil Service side. The biggest difference is the Foreign Service, you are expected to spend about 2/3 of your career overseas. We're America's diplomatic corps. We represent America at embassies and consulates around the world. So we have about 265 offices in roughly 190 countries. And Foreign Service officers work in these embassies, and we're responsible for our bilateral relations with those countries, and also very much involved with protecting American interests overseas. So has anyone here, I assume most people here have traveled overseas? Has anyone had interaction with an American embassy overseas? Did you lose your passport or lost your passport?
Actually, yeah, we lost our passport.
Or got mugged or?
Yeah, it's a long story. But we also were in, my wife was doing a Fulbright in Prague, and so we had contact with the embassy there.
Great. Anyone else?
The lost passport.
Lost passport, right. So an important part of what we do at our embassies around the world is protect American citizens and help them out when they run into difficulties while they're traveling overseas. I'm going to tell you quickly about my career. There's really no such thing as a typical Foreign Service career because we have 5 different career tracks and, as I said, 265 offices around the world. So there's no typical track. So in the sense that there is no typical track, mine is fairly normal or typical. And I joined the Foreign Service 3 years out of college. I came in at the lowest level possible to come in as a junior officer. So I'll tell you a bit about my career, and then I'll tell you quickly about the process for becoming a Foreign Service officer. And I'm going to leave my email address on the board. I am based here in the Bay Area. My office is at Berkeley. I cover Alaska, Montana, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, and my job is recruitment and outreach for the State Department. And I spend a lot of my time answering emails and talking on the phone with people who are interested in the Foreign Service. So I encourage all of you, if you have questions after this is done, we're going to leave time for questions. If you think of something later, you'll have my email address, and feel free to reach out to me and send me an email, and we can meet or talk by phone. So I joined the Foreign Service 3 years out of college. The average age for new Foreign Service officers is 31 or so, 30, 32. The range of people, the sort of the bell curve, the bulk of which is in the 25 to 35-year-old range. So most people who come into the Foreign Service have some life experience where they're working, grad school, combination of those two. My first assignment was in Guangzhou, China. I was issuing or denying visas. I was interviewing applicants for visas to come to the United States from the 4 provinces in southern China. I did that for 2 years. Then I went to Abidjan in the Ivory Coast in West Africa, where I was in charge of the embassy's property for a year. I only stayed there for a year, but I managed all of our furniture and our housing, and it was a big regional embassy at the time, so that was a busy job. From there I went back to Washington. I worked for a year in our 24/7 operations center, and this is the command center that is working all day, all night, 365 days a year. Because it doesn't matter if it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Washington, something could be happening, a tsunami, an earthquake, a plane crash, a military coup d'etat. There's always something happening in the world. And the operations center is that point that embassies reach out to and say, hey, this just happened. And then the operations center lets people in the White House and the State Department and other agencies know what's going on. It was never a fun thing to wake up the Secretary of State at 2 in the morning, and it's Madeleine Albright at the time. And she had a bit of a reputation for being a little bit grumpy. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. But anyway, it was a great job, a great window into the Foreign Service and the State Department and how things operated there. After that, I spent a year working as Special Assistant to the Director General of the Foreign Service. And the Director General is the person in charge of all human resources at the State Department. We have about 80,000 employees altogether around the world, a combination of Foreign Service officers, Foreign Service specialists, and I'll talk a little bit about what that difference is, civil servants. And then we have about 45,000 employees around the world who are nationals of the country. So for example, our embassy in Paris has a couple hundred French citizens who work at our embassy there, and they work there for their whole careers, and they provide a lot of continuity and knowledge for those of us who come in for 2 or 3 years at a time. So I spent a year really learning about the State Department's HR system. From there I went to Sydney, Australia. I spent 4 years as the management officer at the consulate. We have 5 career tracks as Foreign Service officers. We have political officers, economic officers, public diplomacy officers, consular officers, and management officers. Just really briefly, and I'll put our website up there too, and all this information, and actually it's on all the cards there at our website, the careers.state.gov. A lot of detail about the different tracks and what we do, but really briefly, political and economic officers do a lot of the bilateral negotiating with countries. They do reporting on what's happening in the country politically and economically. They report on human rights, religious freedom, trafficking in persons, environmental issues, labor law, a lot of those kinds of things overseas. Consular officers, as I mentioned, they help Americans overseas, and they do visas for immigrants and non-immigrants coming to the United States. Public diplomacy officers are sort of like our communications and marketing branch. They do a lot of getting our message out overseas. Recently, of course, a lot using social media. Our Facebook presence, our Twitter presence is all managed by our public diplomacy officers. And they also manage things like the Fulbright program and exchange programs, bringing foreigners to the United States, but also programs to support Americans doing studies overseas. And then management officers is what I was, and still am, they're the people who keep the logistical platform of embassies running overseas. So human resources, budget, logistics, travel, all that kind of stuff. So I was a management officer at our consulate in Sydney for 4 years. Great place to live. Bill Clinton came and visited as president, so I was the control officer for his visit, and I ended up over the course of my career doing a lot of VIP travel work, which some people don't love, but I always thought it was sort of interesting and fun to put those big VIP visits together. From there I came back to Washington and worked in the office that supported the Deputy Secretary of State for 2 years, organized all of his travel, and traveled around the world with him. Then I went to the White House for a year, and I was asked to go interview for the management officer job basically at the National Security Council. I started 2 weeks before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, so that was a really crazy busy year. I traveled all over the country and overseas with the president, and with Laura Bush I coordinated her first trip, solo trip as First Lady to Europe. But the NSC budget and staffing tripled almost overnight after the 9/11 attacks, and I was responsible for that and for bringing people on board to deal with the aftermath of the attacks. After that, State Department sent me back to grad school for a year. I got my master's in public policy at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton. Then I went to Dublin, Ireland, where I was the management counselor, the management officer for the embassy. I was only there for a year because halfway through my year, I got an email saying would I be interested in going to help reopen our embassy in Baghdad. This was, we had invaded Baghdad in 2003 and deposed Saddam Hussein. And then in the summer of 2004, we formally reopened our embassy and reestablished relations with the Iraqi government. So I said, okay, I went to Baghdad, spent a year in Baghdad working for the ambassador, helping set up this huge new embassy with over 1,000 Americans. So worked and lived in Saddam Hussein's old palace and pretty much locked down on the green zone. From there I went to Vancouver, British Columbia, was Consul General, so I ran our branch office in Western Canada. I was responsible for British Columbia and Yukon Territory. We had 8 U.S. government agencies working out of that office. A lot of cross-border crime issues, law enforcement cooperation, counterterrorism, and then a lot of trade issues. So it was a really interesting job. I was there when we introduced new procedures for crossing the border. It used to be you just showed up and waved and you had American or Canadian accent and everything was fine. We were special friends. And while I was there, we introduced the requirement to have a federally issued identification card, so basically a passport, although there are passport cards which you can use for the northern border. And there was a lot of angst about that, so a lot of my time was spent reassuring communities on both sides of the border that if we work together and we're smart and strategic about introducing this, it didn't have to be a blow to the economic ties and the social and cultural ties between the two countries. And I think time has shown that both sides work together well and it was well implemented. After that, I went back to Washington and spent 3 years running the office that provides all the management support to the Secretary of State, who is Hillary Clinton. I organized all of her travel, and every trip that she did for 3 years, I was on the plane with her, organizing all the logistics for her trip. So flights with the Air Force and working with the embassies and vehicles and communications and hotel rooms and all the pieces that you need for a high-profile, rather large group of people traveling around the world. So I traveled about 500,000 miles with her to, I think, 99, almost in 100 countries. And then she put my name forward to the White House. The president nominated me to be ambassador in Senegal. So I spent 3 years running what is one of our largest embassies in Africa. Senegal is the only country in West Africa that's never had a coup d'etat. So it's a stable, strong democracy. So we have a lot of offices of the U.S. government. For example, the FBI is based in Dakar, but they cover 11 countries in West Africa. FAA is there. We had 19 U.S. government agencies based in Dakar. So we had 175 Americans and about 450 Senegalese staff. So it was a big operation. Spent 3 years there. If people are interested, we can come back during the Q&A session, but the highlights of it were really, there's a very interesting election when I was there that we were quite visible and vocal in trying to push out the former president who was trying to stay for a constitutionally questionable third term. He ended up losing, which made me and the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. government very popular with the new president, which was great. And then Hillary Clinton came as secretary, and then President Obama came during my last year, and we had a great visit with him, which was very exciting. And then I came last summer. I left Senegal and I came here to San Francisco, and where I now, as I said, cover recruiting and outreach for the State Department in the Northwest region. I'm almost out of time with self-imposed time limits here. Very, very quickly, and all the information is on our website, but the process to join the Foreign Service. It's a long process and it's a difficult process. It starts with a written test, which is given 3 times a year. It's free. You can register for it online through our website. We have practice tests on our website, so you can go on this afternoon and take the practice test and see how you do, see what kind of questions we ask. If you pass the written test, you're invited to submit 6 short personal essays that basically describe your qualifications and your background and why you think you would be a strong Foreign Service officer. Those are reviewed by a panel. If you pass that, you're invited to Washington or San Francisco for a full day-long oral assessment, which is a combination of a group exercise with other candidates, a more traditional interview that includes a real interview, sort of, tell us about yourself and why you want to join the Foreign Service and why you want to be a political officer or a public diplomacy officer or whatever. And then also some hypothetical scenarios. You imagine you're at an embassy, the phone rings at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're told XYZ, what do you do next? And then there's a case management exercise, which is you're at a computer and you're sort of fed information and you decide what to do with it. If you pass that, you have to get a security check. All of us have top secret security clearances and a medical clearance to show that you're healthy and able to serve worldwide. And if you pass those 2 steps, you're put on a list, a register of candidates, and we hire off that register. So the process takes about 15 to 18 months. The reason I say that is I get people who say, well, I've got another year to go in grad school, so I'm not ready to start this process. If you've got a year to go in grad school and you're interested in this, you are ready to start the process, because it takes a year to a year and a half to get through it. And the other question I get, I'll just preempted here, is do I have to drop out of grad school, or do I have to quit my job to apply for foreign service? No, of course not. We do not expect people to put their life on hold while they're going through this long process. You should continue working or studying, whatever it is you're doing. Yep?
Quick question, sir. I had actually applied to the Foreign Services before I got accepted to GGU, and I didn't receive the invitation to take the written test until December after my first semester. And because I was in school and I had read up on it and they had told me that you have to be ready to leave immediately or do anything immediately, I didn't schedule my test. Would it look poorly on me if I scheduled it again?
No.
No? Okay.
No, and I think there is a deferment, right? If you go through the process, you pass the oral test and you get your security clearances, and sometimes the security clearance is what takes a long time, depending on how much you've traveled or been overseas. And then if you're finally offered a spot, you can defer it once. You can say, I'm not quite ready, I'm going to graduate in 2 months. So it's a little bit of trying to time it right. I wouldn't encourage people to start the process at the beginning of your first year of a 3-year law degree, for example. But it's certainly when you're in your second or into your third year, I think it's probably safe to start it. I'm going to stop there and let Michelle, my colleague from Washington, she runs, or is deputy director of the office, which means, as you all know, deputy directors are people who really run things. Runs the office that does our recruitment, which is what I do, but also our examination, which is what I was talking about. So, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Wow. Tough act to follow. How many of you, he asked earlier how many of you had traveled overseas. How many of you are interested in just working with the government, period, not necessarily traveling overseas? Okay, so how many of you are familiar with the civil service? Heard of it, governments? Okay. So I'm a career civil service employee. We tend to work for the government in any agency, and so I'm going to just give you a little bit of history on how I came here, and then where I am now, maybe some strategies for applying for jobs in the civil service. So I came to the civil service at around 34, so don't start doing calculations on my age. And I needed a job. I just thought, I was a new parent, I was just trying to get my foot in the door. And the interesting thing about life is that opportunities can come from anywhere. So somebody said, well, there is a clerk typist opening in the military police command down in the Army post. I was living in Panama at the time. And I was like, wow, sure, that sounds fine. Clerk typist sounds okay. I'd already had a career as a teacher, but I was trying to get back in. So I went for an interview, and they said, yeah, we'll take you. And they were really excited. They'd seen my resume, that I spoke 3 languages. And on my very first day, Major Smalls came up to me and said, so here's the thing. What we really need is a crime analyst. But we can't afford a crime analyst. So we hired a clerk typist, but we're going to train you to be a crime analyst. And I was like, oh my God, did God just open up the skies and smile at me? Wow, how cool, what an opportunity. And I strapped on my seatbelt. It's been an incredible ride since then. But a couple of years after doing that, and they trained me how to do fence line checks and how to track weapons and all kinds of things that I never thought I would have done. So every time you think about that job that you think won't be that great a job, think twice, because you never know where opportunities will come from. Shortly after I'd started, I was sent on a peacekeeping operation, which is really an exercise on how different organizations are going to collaborate in the event of an emergency. And I was sent to Brazil because I spoke Portuguese, a little bit rusty now. But when I was there, somebody came up to me and said, so, you should probably try to work for the FBI because you'd probably be really good at that. And I said, really? Sure, why not? So when we came back from the peacekeeping operation, I got on an airplane and went to Miami and literally knocked on the FBI's door and said, I have a resume, and I think I want to be an agent or an analyst, so here's my resume and I want a job. And they kind of did, you know, this sort of thing like my dog does, like, okay, and they said, well, actually, we are going to be hiring some analysts within the next few months, so we'll take your resume. And they sent me a letter when they were opening the announcement, and lo and behold, I was hired with the FBI to be an analyst. Initially, I started off as counter-narcotics, and then I went into counterterrorism. So again, you never know where opportunities come from, and the lesson I took away from that particular time in my life was that sometimes people know you better than you know yourself. So listen to people who have been around you and maybe make suggestions for careers, because you know, they might actually know something that you don't know. Shortly after I'd been with the FBI, I'd been there about 1.5 years, I went from counter-narcotics to counterterrorism, and that was in February of 2001. And a few short months later, 9/11 happened. And at the time, we had 4 counterterrorism analysts at the FBI office in Miami, where 15 of the 19 hijackers had associations to. So that happened in September, and we went into rapid mode. It was really an insane time. I don't think I went home for 2 weeks. We reeked. We smelled so bad. None of us went home, ever. And it was pretty crazy and intense. I try to watch the clock a little bit as well. So, and then everybody, 3 of the analysts actually got jobs somewhere else, and I was suddenly a junior analyst left in charge. So again, opportunities can come from anywhere. I moved to headquarters in Washington, D.C., and 2 years after I was in Washington, D.C., I was sent to Mexico City as the senior counterterrorism analyst out in Mexico City. And when I was there, I fell passionately in love with the Department of State. So when I was there, I worked very closely with a country team at State Department and with representatives from all organizations that were there on really interesting issues, ranging from minor security issues to working with consular officers on U.S. persons who got into trouble overseas, or because people do get arrested overseas. That's surprising, but they do. And then working with people who may have lost their passports and needed us to contact, although Consular did that, but they sometimes came to the FBI there for help too. As Ambassador Lucas mentioned, the FBI is at many different embassies. But I'm not here to talk about the FBI. So I got back, and I started applying for jobs in the civil service as a foreign affairs officer with the Department of State. And a few months after applying to everything that I saw open, I finally got an offer with the State Department. And I've been there since 2008, and it's been amazing. I've had 3 jobs at the Department of State, and each one has been incredible, and all in the civil service. So I started off with counterterrorism, and then I went to work on an outreach program that brought subject matter experts in to teach us everything we needed to know in the community and the department. And then somebody said, as I was looking to get promoted and see where I was going to go next, somebody said, well, you know, there's this job opening up in HR. I was like, HR? What does that mean? And she said, you might be interested in it. And I've been in this job for 3 years. And it's been an incredible, incredible ride. I love this job. I get to think about all kinds of ways to help people like you come into the Department of State. And there is really nothing better that you can do on a daily basis than to help somebody figure out their careers. So with that, I'm going to go into how you come into the Department of State. There are many different ways. The department likes experience, as just as with the Foreign Service, with the Civil Service, we do bring in a lot of experienced people. But we also have a robust internship program that helps you learn about the Department of State. Have any of you done an internship with any of the government agencies or with the department, or considered one? So careers.state.gov. It's on your brochures. I think we're going to write it up here, but that's your central point. That's where you're going to go to find out everything you need to know about the department and about internships. We have a huge internship program. You have to be a rising junior, I believe, to apply, but you can apply for internship, unpaid internships both in Washington DC and at embassies overseas. And what better way to see if this is a good fit for you? With the civil service, then after you've graduated, you'll see opportunities posted, and those come through USA Jobs. How many of you know what USA Jobs is? That's pretty good. So all of you should know what USA Jobs is. Whether you're interested in the foreign service or the civil service, it's you know, where you're going to learn about applying for government. And many times we have people who come into the foreign service who are already in civil service, not just with the Department of State, but all over government. So you remember how I said that I got that clerk typist that wasn't a clerk typist job? Well, that's sometimes what you need to do to get your foot in the door. Sometimes you have to come into a job that you might not be sure is going to be your lifetime career. I've had so many jobs across a career, and every one of them has been a lot of fun. So the key to success is getting your foot in the door and getting a job, doing your very best in that job while you think about where that job is going to take you next, and then taking the next step. Even if you don't come in first to the Department of State with a job, go to work for government, because civil service and foreign service is just that, service. So all of you are here because you're interested in serving your country in some way, and there are many ways you can serve. With the department in the civil service, you can be a foreign affairs officer, you can work in OIG, which looks at our programs overseas and how well we're doing them. You can work in human resources. You can be a budget analyst. You can work in, be a financial person. You can work in, gosh, I think there's almost anything you can pretty much imagine at the Department of State, whether it's in foreign service or civil service. We have construction engineers overseas. We have medical personnel overseas. In the civil service, we also have people who work in Washington, D.C. Anything you can imagine, you know, you can pretty much find a job in it. I'm not going to go too much further. I want to leave opportunities for questions, but I want to encourage you all to go onto that site. It can seem a little daunting at first, but as you navigate USA Jobs, you'll find that there are a lot of opportunities out there, and you can set searches that will send you an alert. So if there's a Department of State job that you want, you can set an alert, and it'll let you know that that job is posted. How many of you know about the Pathways internship program? Okay, so Pathways is another way to come into the civil service. You apply for, these are paid internships while you're in school. Many of them, and most of them actually take place in Washington, D.C., but we have passport agencies located, and we have several in the area, and we have, so you can apply for a Pathways job, and not just with the Department of State, but with other agencies. So look up Pathways in USA Jobs and see what you get, and just apply, because with Pathways, if you've been working for about 6 months to a year with the government, and the office you're working in has an opening, you don't have to compete. They can just convert you into the civil service. It's just that easy. All you have to have done is work there, and it doesn't matter, you just have to be a student. That's it. It doesn't matter what levels. We had a PhD Pathways in our office, actually, and she just got converted to full-time. So you just have to be a student. It doesn't matter. You just have to be currently enrolled. And it's one of the easier ways to actually come in entry level into the civil service. And many of them are laddered positions which go up. Every year, if you're doing a good job, there's promotion potential to a certain level. So that's a really good way to come in. So if you look up, again, USA Jobs Pathways, that's a way to come in. And then, of course, I mentioned our unpaid internship program. I'm going to stop there because I know that you have a lot of questions, and we're happy to answer them. So I'm just going to open it up and let you ask.
So going along with the IEP program, Are you expected to remain enrolled in that program until you finish your academic career? Is that the difference between, I'm trying to distinguish the difference between ITEP and IDP.
Okay, so ITEP are temporary positions in that there is no path directly into a job. So for example, in my office, I might need an intern to work and help me, a paid intern. And so we'll bring in an ITEP, which is a temporary one, because I don't have an opening. I'm not gonna have the opportunity to convert that person to full-time work. An IEP, you have to have a position that you feel you're gonna convert that person. Of course, remember that as a Pathways, you're on trial, you're kind of being tried out, it's your moment to make an impression. So if it's not working out or something happens, you might not get that conversion opportunity. So, you know, always do your very best, put your best foot forward no matter what you're doing. But so that's the difference. With IEPs, they lead directly, you have a job, you don't necessarily with an ITEP, although I have converted ITEPs to full-time positions, they're also convertible.
So kind of going along with that, can you convert an ITEP into an IF?
No, so when you apply for one or the other, that's it, you stay in that. However, if you're in the system, many times we'll have openings within the Department of State only for Pathways. So if there are Pathways who want to go to another office and try something else, we'll post openings only for Pathways that are already in the Department of State, which is really neat, because it gives you an opportunity then to go from an ITEP to an IEP, or try out an office somewhere else, maybe try a foreign affairs job if you're interested in that, or our budget, or any kind of opening that we might have.
As a foreign service officer, did you ever, I mean, because you're obviously expected to represent U.S. foreign policy abroad, did you ever find yourself and your personal beliefs in conflict with like U.S. foreign policy, or know of any officers who've had to deal with that kind of situation and how they kind of reconcile their beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, I get this question a lot, and you know, did everyone hear the question? How do you? So, I don't agree with every policy the government has, but when you become a Foreign Service officer, you take an oath of office that you swear to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. And the way I see this, and maybe rationalize it, is, you know, the president of our country is elected through a democratic process. And he has a prerogative as a president to create a cabinet and to create policies. And so part of my swearing an oath to protect the Constitution is to carry out the policies that the president and his cabinet, duly elected by the American people, promulgate. So, you know, there are times when I had to promote a policy that I personally didn't agree with, but I sort of felt like it didn't matter that I personally didn't agree with it. The president has that prerogative, it's elected by the American people, and it's my job as a public servant to you know, promote or project that policy. There have been Foreign Service officers who have resigned in protest. I actually sent, because I get this question so often now, we have a department of historian,
Yes.
and I sent the historian's office an email and said, in the last 50 years, how many Foreign Service officers have protested, have resigned in protest, and over what issues? And they said they don't track that, and they sent me to the Director General's office. So I sent Connie Gearman an email and said, can you try to find this for me? Because it'd be interesting to know how many, I mean, plenty of us, I think, sort of grumble about certain policies, but I don't think many people have actually resigned in protest.
What role, if any, does the State Department play in, say, international tax enforcement and negotiating agreements between international governments on like new tax laws like FATCA and other laws that are really being brought forth by the DOJ? I mean, does the State Department get involved in any way? Do they coordinate between the two governments?
I mean, I'm kind of going on and guessing a little bit here, you can correct me, but if there's a treaty involved, we're definitely involved, because the State Department works on treaties with other countries. But this is a very technical kind of treaty, so certainly the people who would be working with other governments to draft the law and to draft the treaty would be technical experts, and probably some people from the State Department, but as you said, Department of Justice and other agencies too would be involved in that. And as we both alluded to, the State Department, embassies overseas are a platform for the U.S. government, not just for the State Department. So we have representatives of other agencies at most of our embassies around the world. Some have big interagency, big presence of interagency staff, and some are very small. But certainly, Paris, Mexico City, where you were, big interagency presence.
And we're not an enforcement arm, so we can't enforce. We can work on negotiating, as you mentioned, treaties and all that, but we don't have enforcement authority. So if it comes to taxation, I would probably go to the IRS on collecting, but we don't have the ability to enforce.
If I heard you correctly, you received a master's after you began working at the State Department.
Right.
Do they give you time off, or do you have to get that while you're working, and do they pay for it, or give you some sort of?
There are a couple of different ways. There used to be a program, I think it's still there, that you can sort of do it on your own. You do it on your own time. The program that I did was they paid my salary. The program didn't cost me anything. The books were paid for. There was a fellowship that I got, so I didn't pay tuition. They moved me and my family to Princeton for a year. I had to pay my own housing, but so it was, and then that was my job for a year, was to get the master's program. So they didn't give me time off, but my time that year was spent at school getting the master's degree. So I wasn't trying to balance a job in the department at the same time that I was going to classes. We only send 2 or 3 Foreign Service officers a year to that program, but we have a much broader program that sends quite a few Foreign Service officers and civil servants too, I think, to one of the Army War Colleges, the National War College, the Army War College, the National Defense University. There are a couple, and same thing. You're still on salary. You go for a year full time to get a master's degree program, the master's.
We also have a student repayment program. So if you have student loans, you can apply for the student repayment program, and they pay a percentage of your loan, so they help with that a little bit too.
You said for the Foreign Service that it was like back, you have top security clearance. I mean, how not rigorous is it, but are there deal breakers?
So they look at, diplomatic security looks at a couple of basic things when they're looking at someone's suitability for security clearance. One is, interactions with foreigners and overseas. I mean, if you have close ties to someone who's known to be in another country's foreign intelligence service, that's going to be an issue. So there's sort of the intelligence aspect of it. There is, they look at your financial history. Do you have a lot of debt? Have you declared bankruptcy? Do you manage your finances in a responsible manner? And then they look at sort of personal behavior, including, drinking, drugs, and things like that. My region, is Washington, Oregon, Northern California. I get a lot of questions about, well, if I, hypothetically, a friend of mine is interested in the Foreign Service and he smoked pot in college, is that going to be an issue for him to get a security clearance? The answer that we give people is, first of all, every case is different, so I can't say this is right, this is wrong, if you've done this, you'll get it, and if you did this, you won't. If you get to the point that you're getting a security clearance, if you're still a regular drug user, that's going to be a big count against you. They like to see, they understand that people smoke pot and stuff in college, but the more time that has gone by since the last time that you used drugs, the better. Even if you're in a state where marijuana is legal, it's still illegal federally, and you're being asked to get a job where you will represent the U.S. government overseas. I had a student, Cal, I guess I can say that, but I won't go into more detail, who came in and was like, oh, if I smoke pot, is that a problem? And so I said what I just said, the more time that's gone by, the better, at least a year. And he said, oh, what about selling and dealing? And I said, well, I said that's probably a showstopper. Like, again, I can't say for sure, but that's a whole other level. So, but they do look at your conduct, and your suitability to represent the U.S. government overseas.
Yeah, and so there's a difference between you have to get a top secret security clearance, But you also, at the end of, when you get your medical and everything, there's this thing called final review. And so the final review process actually looks at your suitability, which is a little bit different than your security clearance. And so if you have shown it, you may get a top secret security clearance, but if you've shown a pattern of poor judgment over a long time, they look at that as well. So, you know, you were hanging out with, I don't know, there were a lot of arrests. You know, every time you were at the wrong place at the wrong time, everybody, I can't say specifically, but they do look at patterns, you know, of behavior, just to, you know, do you use good sense? Do you have good judgment? You know, if you went overseas on a Fulbright and you smoked pot, or for the Peace Corps, and you were smoking pot or doing illegal drugs, but you thought it was okay because you were overseas. Well, the fact is you were working for the U.S. government. When you go on the Peace Corps, for the Peace Corps or a Fulbright, you made a commitment to the U.S. government and to their laws. So if you're overseas and you're engaging in that behavior, it shows a lack of judgment. So those sorts of things won't impact your security clearance, but they'll show that you weren't really, you didn't really understand what the commitment was. And so that's something they look at too. And we don't want to scare you. You know, you never know, and it is on a case-by-case basis. So, you know, if you think that that you're interested, and it's been a while, you had a youthful indiscretion, please don't hesitate. But no selling or the other stuff.
How was it being in the foreign service and having family?
So most of us in the Foreign Service have families. The State Department provides free housing overseas, and it's generally, it depends, you know, the quality of the housing, the size of the housing depends a little bit whether you're in downtown London or if you're living in West Africa, but generally very nice housing. Schooling is, education is taken care of for our children. Our kids go to the local, there's always an international or an American school, and then a lot of embassies, a lot of cities have more options than that even. So for example, my last post in Dakar, there were two American curriculum-based schools, sort of a religious-based school, and then the international school, International American School. But then a lot of people in the embassy send their kids to bilingual schools. There are a couple French-English schools there, so their kids could really learn French and be bilingual. So education, and then there's a real sort of commitment by the Foreign Service to have a community overseas. So you find at embassies overseas, now we actually have a position in every embassy called the Community Liaison Officer who's responsible. So, I mean, just an example is, again, in my last post in Dakar, we had a huge trick-or-treating event every Halloween, so that our kids, just because they're living in West Africa, don't have to miss on some of these American traditions that their friends and families back in the States do. So, short answer, almost all of us have families. I think our kids grow up with an incredible appreciation of the world. There's a whole set of literature out there on third culture kids who have this experience of living overseas as kids, and the fact that they're pretty much shown to be more mature in a lot of ways, have an easier time relating to and talking to adults than a lot of their peers who haven't traveled and had that experience.
And you come from an overseas family.
Yeah, I'm not too screwed up. But it's, but it is, I mean, I will say, it has its challenges, and it's tough to move, and I had one move where my oldest daughter, we were in Vancouver, and she did 7th, 8th, and 9th grade there, and she loved it. She had a great group of friends. She was in a great school. We had a great house. I mean, it was a really perfect setup. And it was hard for her to leave. Like, you know, Dad, why do we have to always leave every 3 years? And, you know, just when I get close and make friends. So, you know, there are pros and cons of it. It's a great lifestyle, I think, and a great upbringing, but it can be challenging, especially when you get those teenage years.
Sorry, one follow-up question. Have you ever had to be separated from your family due to a placement?
Yeah, so when I was in Baghdad for that year, there's no families in Baghdad, so they were back in the States and I was in Baghdad.
Do you have an opportunity to stay in a placement longer, or is it like a couple years is up and they tell you when to leave?
Depending on the post, they're usually 2 or 3 years are the assignments, and some you can extend for a year. The hardship post, if you're at a hardship post and you want to extend, that's fine. When I was in Sydney, it was a 3-year post, and I extended for 4 years, but a couple years after that, no more extensions at non-hardship posts. So, but generally you can count on 2 to 4 years maximum at any assignment.
I had a question about families. So what does your spouse do, like, when you're moving around to different countries? Are they just supposed to be like, more or less like a homemaker?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of answers to that. Some spouses join the Foreign Service, so we have what we call tandem couples, where both are in the Foreign Service. Some spouses work on the local economy, and again, that depends a lot on where you are in the world. We have bilateral work agreements with most countries in the world that allows our spouses to work on the economy. So teaching is a popular profession for spouses because you can often find a job teaching. With the internet now, a lot of people have jobs that they can do from anywhere in the world, whether it's proofreading, accountancy kind of work, tax work. I know Foreign Service spouses who are tax accountants and they have the same clients every year, and they email them their tax forms and they do them and they email them back. And it doesn't matter if you're in Ouagadougou or in Oakland. I mean, you can do that. And then we have jobs inside of embassies too. We have a set of jobs that are put aside for spouses, and some are part-time and some are full-time, but it gives spouses the opportunity to work inside the embassy in that environment. So, sort of the online jobs, the local economy, and then inside the embassy jobs.
And we have an actual office within Human Resources that's dedicated just to looking at families, because we recognize that it's really important and that it is tough. It's really tough to move your family overseas. It's not super easy. So the department expends a lot of energy and resources into trying to make that as good as we can within the job. But again, it's the family liaison office, and that's all they do. Is they are dedicated to helping spouses. When officers come back to DC, spouses who have worked overseas actually can be hired into the civil service. So there's numerous programs. We also have programs for spouses who work in consular jobs in visa adjudication. So there are a lot of opportunities, but it's not perfect. It's tough. But we do the very best we can to try to help our spouses, especially, and they're not just women. There's a lot of men nowadays going as the spouse of a Foreign Service officer who's a female. And so, we really are trying to do everything we can to help families, but it is challenging, but the State Department is one big family.
And most embassies also have summer internships for high school and college age kids too.
For the Foreign Service side, do you have any civil service that are still current military members in the reserve side? So
Yeah, in fact, one of the guy who's my Washington-based recruiter who backs me up, Mark Azua, is in the reserves, and he's Foreign Service, but he still is able to do his reserve duty.
and embassies across
No, he does his in a poor guy in Hawaii, so he goes to Hawaii every year for a couple of weeks. But there are a lot of former military, including folks who are still in the reserves in the Foreign Service.
And then secondary question, if you already have a TSSCI on the Department of Defense side, does it transfer or do you have to go?
Actually, you still have to go through the application process. However, there is reciprocity, so we do look at that.
It's really
It helps shorten the time for your clearance process.
So, thank you.
Sorry, we'll go here and then back.
Sure. So my question was actually about safety. So I know that you said that you moved your family around, and it sounds like in some places you were at pretty safe locations. But when you were stationed at places overseas, did you ever feel not safe, or was that ever an issue that came up for you?
You mean from a crime point of view or like a terrorism point of view?
Either.
We have one of our Foreign Service specialties is diplomatic security agents, and so every embassy has a regional security office that is charged with ensuring the safety of the embassy, but also the employees and their family members. So they work very closely with local law enforcement to make sure. So, I mean, Dakar is an example. Dakar is a relatively safe city, but it's a city of 3 million people. I mean, it's like, you're going to have crime. But there's a certain part of town that there was a lot of crime. And so we ended up telling people in the embassy, you cannot be on this stretch of road walking or jogging, after sunset or before sunrise. And so we work very closely to try to figure out where crime is happening. We also, the housing that we get overseas has security features based on where you are in the world, but alarms, bars, double doors, safe rooms, all that kind of stuff we have in our housing. On the terrorism side of things, again, it's a little bit harder, but our security officers work very closely with intelligence officers from other countries to sort of, and our own resources to figure out what the terrorist threat is in countries. If we think it's dangerous, too dangerous, we'll evacuate families out, and we do that, unfortunately, fairly frequently. But we also work very closely to make sure people understand what threats are, and that they are doing things like varying their patterns if we think it's necessary so that they're not an easy target. But we always did, but certainly since Benghazi and Ambassador Stevens and 3 other guys were killed, we take safety and security of our staff and their family members very, very seriously around the world.
Thank you. So it sounds like what you're saying in terms of foreign service appointments is that there's a designated amount of time that you sort of know going in how long you're going to be in Senegal.
Right.
So my question is for proximate appointments, where you're going next. Do you have sort of a stateside supervisor who's in charge of your career development and placing you? Do you apply? How do you go from place to place?
There is an office that's in charge, that is responsible for helping foreign service officers figure out their next steps. But a lot of the burden of figuring out where to go and lobbying for the job falls on the employee, him or herself. What will happen is, so for example, my job at Berkeley is until next summer, 2016. This summer, in June or so, a list will come out of all the foreign service jobs opening up in 2016. And I'll look at that list and I'll think, okay, which are the ones at my level, and then which are the ones that are in my area that I'm interested in. And then I will put in a list of my 6 to 15, minimum 6, maximum 15 choices. And then I'll work within the system to, say, I really want to go to this job, and I think this is why I'll be a really great person for it, and here's what I've done and why I'll be good. And some jobs are more competitive than others, and you don't always get your first choice, but in my experience, most people end up with one of their top choices.
If you get a job offer, are you required to give up your second citizenship?
I'll let you answer that.
We allow dual citizenship. You may not be assigned to the country where you have your other citizenship, because that would create possible conflict of interest. But there are foreign service officers and spouses who have dual citizenship. But you travel overseas on your American passport. You're working as an American diplomat overseas. So most people's second passport sort of sits in a drawer gathering dust.
So I know the deadline to apply is March 2nd. How long for the internship program?
Oh, that's
for the fall
That's for the
intern,
fall
unpaid
internship.
So
Yes,
my
yeah,
follow-up
okay.
was going to be, how long can you realistically expect for your application to take to be processed?
Okay, so, we post them this soon because of the security clearance. So all interns, all unpaid interns, and even we have a small paid internship program, all of them require a secret clearance, so you have to go through the clearance process. On average, so people are getting if they get selections, probably, at the end of, around May, June, I think you'll have selections, maybe a little bit sooner than that, and you'll get an email that gives you all of the information. Once you're selected for a bureau, you'll get an email that says, start your security clearance process. And depending, you could get your clearance really fast. It depends on how much you've traveled overseas or, where you applied. But if you haven't traveled a lot, it's usually pretty fast. If you have, it takes a little bit longer, but it's not impossible. If you travel to Cuba, because we're still looking at, if you travel to certain places, that might take longer for your clearance. It won't preclude you from getting a clearance, but it might take a little bit longer. We have people getting their clearances a month before the fall internship starts, all the way up to actually getting told, okay, can you start in 2 weeks before the internship. So it's a song and dance. It's a little bit complicated because you're trying to make other plans and you're trying to figure everything else out. Where are you interested in going?
Either Los Alamos or Barcelona.
Okay. So
But
So you're asking because you need to make your plans and
exactly,
everything,
if
that's,
it's during the fall, I'm thinking academics,
yeah, exactly.
how do we, so
The
then.
the fall and spring programs are pretty small because of exactly this, it's hard to get
Yeah.
off. So the bulk of our internships are in the summertime. But again, there is a small fall and spring program.
I can't, because I don't know what the clearance process is gonna take, I can tell you that we have people 2 weeks before they're gonna start their internship that get notified they've just gotten their clearance. We tell people don't pay for anything until you know that you have, because sometimes you wanna buy, you gotta buy a non-refundable ticket, where to stay, so, be really careful about doing that, because, again, you have to wait for your clearance process, so that makes it a little bit complicated. We also have our Office of Student Programs, so if you go on the careers.state.gov, you should be able to find an email address for our student programs, and you can send emails to our box. Once you apply, you'll have a point of contact email, and you can send all of your questions there, and they'll be happy to answer those questions. But once you get in the process, it's much easier to know where you are. First, you have to get selected. So, and to be competitive for internships,
There's some construction happening downstairs.
Is it time already? No, to be competitive for internships, as with anything, make sure that you don't exclude information that's interesting. Sometimes you just want to focus on all of your professional everything, or your academic and your GPA, but there might be some really interesting things that you've done that would show up. Like, for example, if you ever went on community service to a farm and you were helping farmers and figuring out how they were doing everything, that's really interesting. That might actually be something that the bureau who's looking at selecting interns, or even for a job, would go, wow, this person, this is a really interesting thing about them, and might actually raise your resume above the others.
And then a follow-up to that, you said that you'll be given a contact email once you apply. Is that contact email to the Office of Student Programs, or is it to the consular embassy to which you
Student
select?
programs.
Student programs.
And would you
We can stay behind
Yeah, we can,
a little bit. Maybe we should stay behind, and if you have
Yeah.
really specific questions, we can address those, but are there any more more general questions? I didn't say anything, but no one's asked about languages, and I didn't mention languages. Let me just quickly say, you don't have to speak a foreign language to join the Foreign Service. We have a school, an institute in DC, outside of DC, that teaches basically every language in the world. So if you come in and as a Foreign Service officer and you don't speak a foreign language, we promise you that within your first 2 assignments, you will go to one of those 2 assignments will be to a job that requires a foreign language, and we will teach you the foreign language. And many people learn many languages during the course of their career. When you learn a language at the institute, again, it's a full-time job. From basically 9 to 5, you're in a very small class with a native speaker learning that language, and we'll take you from 0 to fluent in some languages in 6 months: French, Italian, Spanish, German. Some languages a year, and some languages 2 years. We're talking about the hard Arabic, Chinese, Korean, Japanese. So this is, not everyone sees this as a perk or a benefit, but a lot of people do. We will pay you your salary to learn a foreign language and then send you somewhere where you use it. And then, you can go back to that place or back to a country that speaks that language. Some languages, obviously, Spanish, French, Chinese are more useful than, Estonian. But it is one of the great things about the Foreign Service is learning these languages and having the opportunity to always be learning.
I do ask, can you benefit from this if you already do speak foreign languages?
Yes. So if you already speak a foreign language fluently, we're not on the hook to teach you a language in your first 4 years, but many people come in with a language and then they learn another language with the Foreign Service.
Is the State Department taking any significant hit with the sequestration, and are you seeing any negative impacts on the organization?
Thank you. Well, like all of government, we also were impacted with less budget, the whole trying to do more. So for several years, we had a huge hiring surge over the past 7 years, we've been hiring a lot, and so we're starting to slow down a little bit just because we have a huge tranche of people that we're getting through the system, and so it's just a natural contraction. But I don't want to be disingenuous. I want to, we are paring down a little bit just because budgets sometimes mandate that we do so. But that said, we have to hire somebody. So why not you? So if you don't apply, you self-select out. So go ahead and put your name in the ring and throw out your resume out there because you may be exactly what we're looking for. So don't I was once hired out of a job where I applied and I was one of 500. And if I had known that there were so many applying, I probably wouldn't have applied. But I did, and I got the job. And luck. Definition of luck is being ready when opportunity knocks.
So actually, maybe that's a good point, maybe to stop the formal portion, as some students have class to get to, but if you're willing
Thank you
to
all very
stay,
much.
thank you so much.